My family was never the type to believe in ghosts. I also never paid much attention to scary stories. I always thought those things were tales meant to frighten children. However, what happened to me on a weekend trip changed my perception of what is real or imaginary. It all started when I decided to get away from the city for a while. I needed peace and quiet, and my friend Emily recommended a small cabin in the countryside, owned by someone she knew. She said she had stayed there before and that the place was perfect for relaxing, far from the chaos of city life. I had never heard of the town where the cabin was located, but Emily assured me the place was safe and peaceful. So I didn't think twice. I packed my bags and set out on a Friday afternoon. The road there was surrounded by a dense forest, and as the sun began to set, the atmosphere took on a darker tone, but I convinced myself it was just the fatigue from the trip. When I arrived at the cabin, the building looked simple but cozy. It was made of dark wood, with large windows and a porch that faced the forest. I grabbed the keys from under the doormat, as instructed, and entered. The interior was rustic but comfortable, with old furniture, a fireplace, and the distant sound of the surrounding forest creating an almost bucolic atmosphere. The sense of isolation was both comforting and strangely unsettling. That first night everything seemed normal. I made some tea, wrapped myself in a blanket, and started reading a book. However, around midnight, I felt uneasy, as if I wasn't alone. A chill ran down my spine, but I ignored it, telling myself it was just the unusual silence making me nervous. It wasn't until the second day that things started to get strange. I woke up with the feeling that something was wrong. The air inside the cabin felt heavier, as if something invisible was present. There were no signs of a break-in, no open windows, nothing out of place, but the feeling persisted. I convinced myself it was just paranoia and decided to go for a walk in the forest, trying to shake off that sensation. When I returned, I noticed the cabin door was slightly ajar. I clearly remembered locking it before I left. My heart raced, and an irrational panic overtook me. I entered slowly, each step echoing on the wooden floor. The cabin looked exactly as I had left it. Or almost. In the middle of the living room on the coffee table, there was an object I knew hadn't been there before. An old hand mirror. It was made of tarnished silver, with intricate arabesque designs, and its glass was cloudy and dull. I had no idea where it had come from. It was as if someone or something wanted me to find it. That night was the worst of my life. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was watching me. It wasn't just a vague feeling. I could sense the presence close to me, breathing heavily. My body froze with fear. The mirror, now placed on a shelf, seemed to radiate a dark energy. I tried not to look at it, but it was impossible to ignore. It seemed to call to me, as if something inside it was watching me back. Around 3 a.m., the sound began. It was a low sound like whispers, coming from all directions. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The sound seemed to grow louder, filling the cabin, a mix of indistinct voices, as if many people were speaking at the same time, but without saying any understandable words. Fear consumed me. I got up and went to the living room where the fireplace was out. The mirror was there still, but the sense that something was behind that glass terrified me. Suddenly, the silence fell. That's when I heard footsteps, light but steady, coming from upstairs. The problem was, the cabin didn't have an upstairs. Froze. It was impossible. I knew every corner of that house. There were no stairs, no second floor. But the footsteps continued. Slowly, they seemed to approach, descending along the walls, as if something was crawling, moving in the shadows, without ever fully revealing itself. Terrified, I tried to leave the cabin, but the front door wouldn't open. It was as if it was locked from the inside, but I hadn't used the key. I was trapped. The mirror, which I had been desperately trying to avoid, now seemed to glow with a pale light. And then I saw it. In the mirror's reflection, there was a figure. It wasn't in the room with me, but I could see it in the glass. It was tall, with disproportionate limbs and deep-set eyes that glowed an intense red. There was no expression on its face, just a terrifying emptiness that sucked all the air from the room. My breathing became shallow, and I felt myself fainting. The figure, which at first seemed static, slowly started moving in the reflection, coming toward me through the mirror. But when I turned around, the room was empty. That thing only existed in the reflection, but I knew that somehow it was there with me. Suddenly, the mirror fell to the floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces. The moment the glass broke, the presence disappeared. The air started flowing again, and the front door opened on its own. I ran without looking back, feeling that if I did, that thing would be following me. I never went back to that cabin. When I tried to tell Emily the story, she gave me a strange look and said that the cabin had been demolished more than 10 years ago. That cabin should never have existed, and what I found there should never be seen. When Emily told me that the cabin had been demolished 10 years ago, my heart stopped for a second. I laughed, thinking it was a bad joke, but she kept staring at me, serious, waiting for my reaction. That moment, everything inside me went cold. "What do you mean, demolished?" I asked, trying to stay calm, though my mind was already racing in 1,000 directions. "I was there last weekend. I stayed for 2 days." She shook her head slowly, as if trying to find the right words. "I don't know what you saw, but that cabin, it was demolished after a fire. The property owner died inside, burned alive. After that, no one ever built anything on that land again." Her words hung in the air, heavy, but I refused to believe them. Had been there. I saw the cabin. I slept inside it. A mirror. A mirror. The figure in the reflection. Everything was etched in my mind with a clarity that gave me chills just remembering. "I'll show you," Emily said, grabbing her phone and quickly searching for something. She turned the screen toward me, and there it was, proof. A newspaper article, dated 8 years ago, talking about a fire at an isolated property. The owner, a man in his 60s, had been found dead, partially burned, under mysterious circumstances. The fire had started in the living room, next to an old fireplace, exactly where I had been. The photo showed the ruins of the cabin. Almost nothing remained except the charred foundations and pieces of blackened wood. But it was the same place. The same location where I swore I had spent 2 days. I couldn't believe it. The image of the cabin, the mirror, that figure in the reflection, all spun in my mind, trying to align with what I was seeing now. "This is impossible," I whispered, still staring at the screen. "I was there. How could this have happened?" Emily looked confused, but not disbelieving. She had already heard strange stories about that place. Some said that after the fire, people who ventured into the nearby forest sometimes saw the cabin, as if it were still there. Others spoke of noises, voices, and even the presence of something that couldn't be directly seen, but that everyone felt. "I didn't know you were going there," she finally said. "If I had known, I would have warned you. That place, it's not real anymore. At least, not in the way you think." But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. That cabin existed, somehow, in a space between the real and the unreal. And whatever was inside it, that presence, was more alive than anything I had ever felt. "I need to go back," I declared, almost without realizing what I was saying. Emily's eyes widened, grabbing my arm firmly. "No, you're not. No one goes back there." But as much as I knew she was right, something inside me, a dark curiosity, a need to understand the inexplicable, was pulling me toward that place. It was as if the cabin was calling me back, as if what I saw in the mirror wasn't finished. In the weeks that followed, I tried to go on with my life, to ignore what had happened, but the memory of that night haunted me. I dreamed about the mirror, about the deformed figure that moved only in the reflection. I heard the whispers again, even when I was awake, and I started noticing strange things in my apartment. Objects shifted places, doors that I was sure I had locked appeared slightly open, and sometimes in the silence of the night, I heard footsteps. The same footsteps I had heard that night in the cabin. It was consuming me. That's when I decided I had no choice. I had to go back, had to confront whatever that presence was. Emily tried to stop me, but I was determined. If I didn't face it, I would never have peace. So, on a Friday night, I got in my car and drove to the place where the cabin had stood. I reached the same spot on the road where I had parked the first time. The forest was darker than I remembered, and the air felt strange, heavy, as if nature itself knew I was about to make a mistake. With a flashlight in hand, I followed the trail to where the cabin should have been. As I got closer, the silence deepened. There were no sounds of animals, no wind, no rustling leaves. Just a suffocating emptiness. And then I saw it. It was there exactly as before. Cabin. Intact, as if it had never burned. The dark wood, the large windows, the porch. Everything was the same. I knew it wasn't possible. I knew the place I was seeing shouldn't exist. But there it was, as if waiting for me. As if it knew I would come back. I walked slowly toward the door, my heart pounding so hard it sounded like distant drums. I opened the door, which of course wasn't locked, and stepped inside. The living room was exactly as I remembered. The couch, the fireplace, the coffee table. And the mirror. The same silver mirror, resting on the shelf, calling to me, daring me to look again. I swallowed hard, trying to control the fear rising in my throat. Every part of me screamed to leave, but I had to know. I had to understand. I approached the mirror, hesitant. And when I finally looked into the reflection, there it was. The figure. The same red eyes, the deformed and disproportionate body, watching me from the other side of the glass. But this time it didn't stay still. The figure started moving again, but now there was something different. It wasn't just approaching me in the reflection. I could feel it getting closer in the room. The temperature dropped suddenly, and I heard the breathing, heavy, slow, coming from all directions. Terror gripped me as I realized that this time, it wouldn't stay just in the mirror. I wanted to run, but my legs were glued to the floor, as if the cabin itself had trapped me there. The cold around me seemed to drain the energy from my body, and my breathing became shallow, increasingly difficult. The figure in the mirror now seemed to materialize in the room, its red eyes glowing in the dark as its distorted body crawled out of the reflection. My mind screamed that it wasn't possible, but I knew it was happening. It was coming out of the mirror, and now I was face to face with something that should never exist. Its footsteps, once only heard in the shadows, now echoed through the old wooden cabin, as if each movement drained the life from the world around us. Panic grew inside me, but something deeper, a small, almost inaudible voice, told me not to run. If I ran, it would follow. If I faced it, maybe there was a chance. Maybe. Why are you here? My voice came out in a weak whisper, my throat dry from fear. The figure stopped, its body contorting grotesquely as if trying to adjust to our reality. Its red eyes burned into me, and then, without opening its mouth, it answered. You called me. The words weren't spoken but echoed in my mind like a distant, scratchy voice. My body froze, and suddenly everything made sense. The cabin, the mirror, the whispers. I had called it. From the moment I stepped into that cabin, from the moment I looked into the mirror. Somehow, I had been the one to bring it here. It took another step forward, and the air around me grew even heavier. I felt an invisible force pulling at me, as if it was sucking the very essence out of me, erasing my presence from reality. My heart pounded frantically, and I knew that if it took one more step, everything would be lost. I would be consumed. Then I remembered. A mirror came from the mirror. With the last bit of strength I had left, I turned and grabbed the mirror from the shelf, my hands trembling. Its eyes flared with fury, as if it knew what I was about to do. Without thinking, I smashed the mirror to the floor with all my strength. The sound of the glass shattering was like an explosion in the room. Each shard seemed to release a sharp, painful scream, as if the very air was being torn apart. The space around me seemed to collapse for a moment. The cabin, the cold, the darkness, everything began to distort and lose its shape. And then silence. I was lying on the floor, breathing heavily, my body trembling and cold, surrounded by pieces of broken glass. The figure was gone. There was no longer any evil presence, no sign of that thing that had been after me. I struggled to my feet, looking around. The cabin was still there, but something had changed. The air was no longer heavy. The oppression had vanished. Everything was quiet, almost normal. With my legs shaking, I staggered to the door. I needed to get out. When I opened the door and stepped outside, the cool night air wrapped around me, bringing such a wave of relief that I nearly collapsed to my knees. I looked back, expecting to see the burned ruins of the cabin, but it was still there, intact. However, this time I knew I would never return. I ran to my car and drove non-stop until I reached the city. Whatever had happened that night, I couldn't explain. The only certainty that remained was that I had called it, and somehow I had survived. In the days that followed, I tried to return to my life, pushing away the memories of that place. But something continued to haunt me. I always felt like it wasn't over. Sometimes I heard footsteps in my apartment. Other times, whispers that belonged to no one. But I convinced myself that it was all just my imagination. Until one morning I received a package. There was no sender, only my name written in a shaky, uneven handwriting. With my heart racing, I opened the box, and inside, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was the mirror. The same silver mirror, intact, without a single scratch. It was there, as if it had never been broken. In that moment I knew I could never escape. The mirror would find me wherever I went. And sooner or later it would take me back to that cabin. Because I had called it, and now it was waiting.